Kentucky basketball definitely has the depth to run the platoon like they did a decade ago. But should Mark Pope and the Cats actually run essentially two different rotations? I don't think so. We'll talk about what they should do on today's episode of Locked On Kentucky.
You are Locked On Kentucky, your daily podcast on the Kentucky Wildcats. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, what's going on, Big Blue Nation? Welcome on into Locked On Kentucky, your daily Kentucky Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Lance Dawe, and on today's episode of Locked On Kentucky, we are going to be talking about Kentucky basketball, their depth, and the platoon. We've talked about this essentially every single offseason on this show about whether or not Kentucky should do it, whether or not they could do it, and this season, I think, there's no better time to have a conversation about the Wildcats and their depth, considering the transfer portal additions that Mark Pope and company have brought in. But should Mark Pope and company actually run said platoon? Let's talk about it on today's episode, as well as Otega Oweh's role on this team. We've got a bold prediction coming in here from a listener about how he could impact the scoring column for the Wildcats this upcoming season. Thank you so much for making Locked On Kentucky your first listen every single day. Want to remind everyone out there that we are free and available on all platforms. And if you are watching on YouTube, I would greatly appreciate it if you subscribe to the show. And if you are listening on podcast, I would also appreciate it if you subscribed there as well. Today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. You can download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. Kentucky basketball, I think, has the 10-man rotation to legitimately run a platoon system this upcoming season. And I don't think the Wildcats are going to run the platoon, but they definitely have the option. Before we talk about this year's roster, I kind of want to take a step back and explain what the platoon system is and how Kentucky in the past with Coach Cal kind of utilized this during the 2014-15 season for a brief moment. We'll talk about the effectiveness of it, whether or not it actually mattered, whether or not Kentucky should have gone different directions with that roster, and then we'll actually take a look at this year's roster and talk about how maybe they can take some things from that 2014-15 season and maybe add some more things onto it. So the depth and the talent of that 2014-15 team cannot be understated. They had 9 different McDonald's All-Americans on that roster. The team was stacked. Kentucky obviously 38-0 up until playing Wisconsin in a brutal loss, 38-1. For the entire season. Karl-Anthony Towns, the Harrison twins, Trey Lyles, Devin Booker, Dakari Johnson, Willie Cauley-Stein, Alex Poythress, who played in that platoon for the first 8 or 9 games of the season, Tyler Ulis, Marcus Lee, guys like Derek Willis and Dominic Hawkins, who would become more relevant in future seasons. This was a very good team, and they dominated on both sides of the ball. Kentucky was 6th in the nation in adjusted offensive efficiency, and they were 1st in the country in adjusted defensive efficiency. No team held opponents to a lower shooting percentage than the Kentucky Wildcats. They were tops in the nation in 3-point defense, 2nd in 2-point defense, 2nd in blocks, 48th in turnovers. This team did everything. They were extremely tall. They could shoot the basketball. They could run. They could distribute. They could do everything that you wanted a dominant college basketball team to do, and they did. And they did it for the first 9 games of the season utilizing a platoon system. Because Kentucky had those 9 McDonald's All-Americans and they had all of this talent on their roster, Coach Cal and his staff elected to do something a little different as far as the rotation goes to make every player happy. They had a starting lineup of 5 players, and whenever they went to sub in players, they would just sub out every single starter and replace them with a new unit. They would platoon. So to take a look at what happened through those first 8 or 9 games, the platoon system went like this. You had your blue team and your white team. Your starters were Andrew Harrison and Aaron Harrison, Alex Poythress, Willie Cauley-Stein, Karl-Anthony Towns. Kentucky utilized a 2-center system. Very tall lineup here, obviously, with the guards there with the Harrison twins. And then you got to the white team, which was Tyler Ulis, Devin Booker, Trey Lyles, Marcus Lee, and Dakari Johnson. That's what Kentucky ended up doing for the first 8 or 9 games of the season before Poitras got hurt, knee injury, out for the season. So Kentucky had to mix things up a little bit, and if I'm not mistaken, Trey Lyles kind of took over that 3 spot as the season went on and ended up being the primary guy there, despite not being an extremely versatile piece, not known as a three-point shooter at that small forward spot. But Kentucky had a lot of height. They all had a lot of guys that could dominate at the rim, and that's what they essentially elected to do with both of these lineups. But the rotation was created to make these players happy. And I think the goal also in mind was to, this was the most effective way to go out there, make players happy, and then also to be efficient and succeed on the basketball court. A friend of the program, Hoops Insight, who we've had on the show a couple of different times, back whenever he was doing his newsletter, his Substack newsletter, he actually wrote a few different articles about this team. I would highly encourage you to go check that out at Hoops Insight on Twitter. He's got links to his old Substack. But this article that he did 3 years ago kind of broke down how Kentucky utilized their platoon system, and he broke the numbers down of, okay, how successful was Kentucky with this platoon and how successful were they without, essentially, after Poitras got hurt. And Kentucky kind of strayed away from it, and there were positives, there were negatives, but at the end of the day, there was nothing significant enough about the platoon system in terms of winning basketball games or being more dominant in basketball games that would lead you to believe that Kentucky should have continued it or tried to replicate it in future seasons. And Coach Cal has said as much whenever he's had a ton of depth, when he's had different guys come off the bench that we think should either be starting or playing starting minutes. And Cal has made it very clear that he's never going to do it again. And quite frankly, I don't think Kentucky should. And with this year's team with Mark Pope, I don't necessarily know if it's the smartest direction to go to just have 2 lineups, because this is something we've talked about recently. There are a number of players on this roster that are mouths to feed, pretty much. Kentucky's got 8 or 9 or even 10 guys that were really solid role players at their previous schools or were double-digit scorers, and Kentucky's going to have to try and find a way to get all of these guys touches and to make them happy, coinciding with the fact that Mark Pope really wants to be a team-oriented program. He wants to make sure that the whole is more significant than the individual. But those things kind of mixing and matching there. Kentucky, I think, when you look at this 2014-15 team, when you look at the fact that they had all of this talent, right, and they essentially had to kind of break things down, I think you're going to see some similar things with this year's team as far as rotation goes, as far as minutes, as far as possessions used. We've talked about the usage rate of these guys several times on the show. In fact, we brought it up yesterday when we talked about this team and who could lead the team in points per game. But I don't think you're going to see a platoon, and quite frankly, I don't think you should, because the most important thing about this year's roster, and Mark Pope has harped on this a little bit, is just because is how experienced and how flexible the rotation is. You have a 1A and a 1B at every single position. And I don't think you should essentially relegate that to just 2 different rotations. You should be able to mix and match and do a ton of different things. So at the end of the day, the minutes, the utilization of these players may balance out to be statistically similar to that 2014-15 squad. But I think you're going to see a lot more different things tried. And obviously things were discussed and things were changed after Poitras got hurt 10 years ago. But I think that Kentucky is not going to try and limit themselves this upcoming season. Let's talk a little bit about this year's roster. Let's talk about what these rotations look like, the starters, the bench players. Let's also take a look at a recent Twitter video that Kentucky basketball put out. Let's talk about how the 2 different teams kind of split, and that maybe gives us some insight as to how Kentucky will use their rotation this season. Before we dive into that, though, I do want to tell you guys about our friends over at GameTime. I've really enjoyed going to a ton of different MLB games so far this summer, getting to see the Braves play against the likes of the Phillies, the Giants. It's been super fun, and there is only one place that I go to get my MLB tickets, and that is over at GameTime. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, and it makes getting tickets even faster and easier. And prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer you get to the first pitch. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and then their best price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. I also utilize Game Time quite a bit last college football season, and I'll definitely be using them again this fall. Super, super easy to get in and out of the app super quick. The prices are all up front. There's no hidden fees. You get to go and take a look at your seat, and the pictures are phenomenal representations of what you're actually getting to see in person. And on top of that, the seats that I was in during college football last year, they actually ended up being somehow even better than what the phenomenal images were on Game Time. I really, really enjoy using the Game Time app. It is the only place you need to go to get MLB tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying your Major League Baseball tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, continuing along here on the Tuesday edition of Locked On Kentucky. Lance Dawe hanging out here with you again. I appreciate you guys checking out the show today. If you have not subscribed to the YouTube channel or the podcast feed, I would really appreciate it if you went ahead and did so. Talking about how Kentucky basketball, they could run the platoon this upcoming season. They've got the depth. They've got the experience. They've got all of these different players that are going to demand attention and get the basketball at various points throughout the season. They could run the platoon, but I don't necessarily think that they should, and also they're just simply, I don't think that's how Mark Pope wants to roll. So what can we take from that 2014-15 squad, and how can we apply it to this year's team while also acknowledging that things are going to look a little different? Well, I think that we need to first acknowledge that what happened in 2014 and 15 in terms of talent cannot be duplicated. But as far as the 1A, 1B aspect of both of these teams, I think it can definitely be replicated by this team, a decade later. Now, whenever I say 1A and 1B, I don't mean it in the context of platoon, as in you've got your starter and then you've got your bench player, and both of them are kind of good, but they stay with their respective platoon. I think that Kentucky this year, with their depth, has, let's say, for instance, at the point guard position, you've got Lamont Butler and you've got Kerr Kriisa. Lamont Butler, Mountain West Defensive Player of the Year last season. Very, very solid guard, but known for his defense and then his clutch shot making during the NCAA tournament run that San Diego State had 2 seasons ago. But he's known for his defense. Kerr Kriisa, one of the best distributors in college basketball over the last several seasons, both at Arizona and West Virginia. Really solid three-point shooter as well. Offensively, dominant at times during his runs at his 2 previous schools. Butler and Kriisa playing the same position. Stylistically, I think a little bit different when you talk about them on an individual level. They fit into the system. Both of them do very, very well, in my opinion. And it's kind of a 1A, 1B, but it's not like, okay, Butler's going to run with the starters and Kriisa's essentially going to be a backup. That's not the case at all, and I'll explain why here definitively in just a second. But Kriisa, I think, definitely does rotate in with different lineups very well, as does Lamont Butler. If you want to have more defense, Kentucky's going to trot out a lineup that more than likely consists of Lamont Butler, Jaxson Robinson, Andrew Carr, Amari Williams, somebody like Otega Oweh. Also, you could throw in there that are really good defensive players. 3 best defensive players on this roster, I think, are Butler, Oweh, and Williams. You're probably going to get a lineup with those guys, right? But if you want shooters, if you want a guard-oriented lineup that can really knock down outside shots, Kerr Kriisa, Kobe Brea, either Jaxson Robinson or Otega. You could have Ainsley Almanor. And then I would probably put Amari Williams in there at the 5 just because of how good of a passer he is. Obviously not a shooter from beyond the arc, but definitely a really good passer and somebody that I think will be utilized a ton for Kentucky. Or you could put Andrew Carr at the 5 if you wanted to and have 5 different guys out there that could really knock down shots from beyond the arc. There are so many different ways that I think you can mix and match these guys where you look at the guy that's going to start. like Butler and say, okay, he's really, really good in all these different areas. But you look at the bench player and you don't really see a drop-off. You just see a different type of player that fits the mold of what Kentucky wants to do really well this upcoming season, if you understand what I'm saying. Let's take it here to the small forward position. Jaxson Robinson, probably going to start for Kentucky this upcoming season. I know he came off the bench for BYU last year, but he's probably going to start for UK. Otega Oweh is a very, very solid player, really good at Oklahoma a season ago, and we're going to talk about him a little bit more to wrap up the show. But Oweh, I think you could definitely say, is a better defender. Statistically, he's a more efficient shooter, and he does some different things that Jaxson Robinson doesn't. But what Jaxson Robinson brings to the table is the ability to create off the dribble, is the ability to hit some mid-range shots, is also the ability to kind of play a more impactful role at times offensively because of just how much time he spent with Mark Pope. So I think there's a give and a take here for every single position. And if you wanted to swap guys out, I think you really could do so comfortably and essentially say, hey, we are operating with a 10-man rotation that's extremely deep, and there is a level of talent that we've kind of all hit. There's definitely a high floor with these guys. Not necessarily a high ceiling with any of them. Obviously, we've talked about Jaxson Robinson essentially being the only star, quote unquote, on this team, but you've got a high floor to work with, is all I'm saying here. So I don't think Kentucky should limit themselves, but I do think the concept of having so many good players that kind of fit a mold here, like we had in 2014-15, I think that does ring true with this year's roster. Now, to just give you an idea of kind of what we're thinking as far as starting lineup and bench, so to speak, goes, we've got here a pretty good idea because of the fact that Lamont Butler has come out and said, hey, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be the starting point guard this year. So it would be more than likely, if just humor me for a second, Lamont Butler, Kobe Brea, Jaxson Robinson, Andrew Carr, and Amari Williams. Right? And then the bench would be Kerr Kriisa, Colin Chandler, Otega Oweh, Ainsley Almanor, Brandon Garrison. Chandler, I think, is interchangeable with both Travis Perry or Trent Noah. And if you're talking about Kentucky forcing themselves into a platoon, I think Kentucky would be more balanced if they put Oweh at the 3 and they had Robinson coming off the bench. But that's just me. Kentucky's not going to do that, though. But you see this starting lineup and you see these backups. Kerr Kriisa, Lamont Butler, really good. Kobe Brea and Colin Chandler. I think Colin Chandler's very underrated heading into this season. I think him and Brea are going to be very good for the Cats at that 2-guard spot. Oweh and Robinson, we just talked about them. Ainsley Almanor and Andrew Carr. Both do very, very solid things. Almanor, I think, is also an underrated shooter, I want to say here, heading into this year. I think he's going to be a very fun piece coming off the bench. Garrison, talked a ton about his upside. I love the fact that Garrison is on this roster. I think he's going to be really good for Kentucky for seasons to come. And then Amari Williams, 3-time conference DPOI. He's probably going to be a first or second team all-defense guy for the SEC this upcoming season. There's a lot of different things to like about this team just because of how good different guys are at different things, and it all blends together so, so well. This team could run the platoon because of the balanced depth they have at each position, but at the end of the day, they shouldn't because of how interchangeable all the pieces are, and you can get different types of lineups that are really good at different things when you want to try different stuff out or have to in the flow of a game. That's my thought on Kentucky basketball, the platoon, and maybe running some more balanced lineups this upcoming season. I don't think they're going to do it, but I think we're going to see some depth and some balance when all is said and done. So let me know what you think in the comments below about Kentucky this year and their rotation. I want to talk here about one specific player to wrap up the show who I think, alongside a number of players on this roster, should be getting more love, more attention, and may end up being a more important piece than we realize here at the beginning of July. Before we get into that, I just want to remind you guys, hey, if you have not checked out the Locked On Kentucky Discord, it's a really fun place to come and hang out. It's free. It's just for anybody that wants to talk about Kentucky basketball, Kentucky football, baseball. SEC Media Days is coming up here soon. We're going to get to talk a lot about what Mark Stoops and company are going to do this upcoming season with Brock Vandegrift at the helm. It's going to be super, super fun to have you guys all in there. So if you want to check it out, at @LanceDawe_, you can see the Twitter handle here on YouTube if you're watching there, but at @LanceDawe_ on Twitter/X. If you want to go check out my account, pinned at the top of my account is a link to join the Discord. Again, it's free, just a place for all of us to chat about all things Kentucky athletics. All right, wrapping up the Tuesday edition of Locked On Kentucky. We've talked about the platoon. We've talked about this year's rotation. Very interchangeable. I don't think Kentucky should limit themselves, and frankly, I don't think they won't. They just won't do it. Well, we got a bold prediction here from a listener over on YouTube about Otega Oweh and how he could be utilized for the Wildcats this upcoming season. Jordan Clayton 7143 says Otega Oweh will be a top 2 scorer on the team this season. And if you listened to our episode yesterday, and I would highly encourage you guys to go check it out, we asked the question, who will lead Kentucky basketball in scoring this upcoming season, points per game? And we went through a number of different players that could possibly do that. Jaxson Robinson, Andrew Carr. I settled on Kobe Brea as my pick to lead the team in scoring this upcoming season, I should say. But Otega Oweh was the second player that we discussed. And you go and look at his statistics and you think about how he fits in here with the Wildcats, and you really do start to paint a picture of not only just a good scorer, but a very important piece to the roster that I think will be vital, especially if Kentucky wants to make a legitimate postseason run. Otega Oweh a season ago, 11.4 points per game, while shooting 49.3% from the floor, 37.7% from beyond the arc, while also grabbing almost 4 rebounds, 1 assist, 1.5 steals per game. Really, really solid numbers from the sophomore guard/wing at 6'5" with some muscle to boot. Otega was one of the better defenders in the Big 12 this past season, as noted by those 1.5 steals per game, but he was also one of the more efficient players on a roster full of really solid offensive options a season ago. Some solid options at the guard position, I may note as well. That 49% from the floor and 37.7% from 3 are both very promising statistics. I think the big thing to note here about Oweh is that he doesn't take a ton of threes. He only averaged 1.7 last season, but I think he's going to continue to grow with confidence, especially underneath a new system in Mark Pope, where players are going to be asked to take a ton of threes. I think Otega will factor into this offense, not just obviously making shots at the rim, but he's also going to shoot the 3 a little bit more. And if he's able to maintain a 35 to 38% clip, he's going to be right up here at the top of the list when it comes to scores for the Wildcats this season. And I think it's going to be really important that if Oweh is not like a top 3 option this year, he is at least encouraged in a variety of games this season to explore being a more dominant ball handler and explore being a more dominant shooter in terms of just possessions used and different things like that. Because Otega, if you think about, not this season, but next season, is going to be a vital piece to the roster. A lot of these guys are 5th-year seniors. A lot of these guys are graduated or are going to graduate, and they're going to leave. Otega will be one of the few players left on roster next season, alongside the likes of Brandon Garrison, Travis Perry, Colin Chandler, Trent Noah. You're going to need somebody like Oweh who can be a leader, not just obviously on the court verbally and then from a discipline standpoint, but also from a scoring perspective, from a defense perspective. And I think that Oweh really showed some promise in year 2 in a very tough conference. If he's able to kind of show flashes of it or even take the next step, period, this season, average somewhere between 12 to 14 points per game for the Wildcats, which would be difficult considering how balanced this team is, I think that he could very well end up in that conversation as maybe a top 3 option, could even be the leading scorer on this team. That's why we talked about him on yesterday's show. So the listener here, Jordan, saying Otega Oweh could possibly be a top 2 option for the Wildcats this season. I don't think it's entirely out of the realm of possibility. In fact, I think it's very possible. So as far as bold predictions go, I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 10. Lowest boldness prediction. It's the least bold, I should say. I'm stumbling over myself. It's the least bold prediction we've had. But I still really do like this because I think that Otega will bring a lot more to the plate. And if he also adds, oh, look, second leading scorer on the team on solid efficiency on a team full of players that will all average somewhere near double digits or at least contribute efficiency-wise to that, I think Otega would put himself in a really solid spot to be somebody that the Kentucky fan base really, really loves and will love for the next couple of seasons. So let me know what you think in the YouTube comments below about Otega Oweh. And I want to wrap up the show here, just making a note to kind of bring this back to Oweh and the rotation and how Kentucky's going to utilize stuff. So Kentucky put out a practice video earlier today, just showing highlights from the different scrimmages and stuff that they're doing. And they had obviously blue and white jerseys, 1 and 2 rotations for the team. And here's what we saw in that video. The team in blue, which I would assume to be the starters, at least in this scrimmage, were Kerr Kriisa, Kobe Brea, Jaxson Robinson, Andrew Carr, and Amari Williams. Obviously, we've talked about Butler being the starting point guard, so I think Kentucky's just using them interchangeably at that spot. The white team was Lamont Butler, Travis Perry, Otega Oweh, Ainsley Almanor, and Brandon Garrison. That's who they showed in the highlights. That starting 5, from Kriisa to Carr, that's tough to stop. I'll say that. That's very tough to stop if you want to spread it out and shoot threes. And also you have a 6'11", 250-pound big man in the middle waiting to either be on the receiving end of a pass on a cut for a dunk, or he's going to be the one giving the ball out for a kick-out 3. That's a tough starting 5 to deal with. And then you've got Lamont Butler, Travis Perry, Otega Oweh, Ainsley Almanor, and Brandon Garrison. You've got 3 really good shooters in the middle of that lineup. You've got a blossoming center in Brandon Garrison. You've got 2 really good defenders in Butler and Oweh. This is a fun team, man. This is a fun team to look at as far as balance. If you swap Brea swapped to a white jersey at the end, and then Chandler was blue coming off the bench. Colin Chandler, that was, as was Noah. But I think that you're starting to see a clear picture of how Kentucky wants to utilize players at each position. It's not going to be a question of, oh, does DJ Wagner start at point guard, or does Rob Dillingham like we had last season, not just at the beginning of the season, but throughout the entire year of, okay, why aren't certain guys playing at these positions, and why are guys playing at these positions, period, when they're extremely ineffective at one, but they're good at the other. All of that to say, Kentucky's laid out a clear path for themselves as far as how they want to manage themselves. And seeing stuff like this with the practice video, I think, is encouraging. It's also exciting because of just how good these guys are at scoring and playing a little bit of defense as well. So let me know what you think in the comments below about the rotation, about Otega, about the platoon, all of that good stuff. That's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Kentucky. Hey, you can follow the show on Twitter at LockedOnUK. You can follow me on Twitter at LanceDawe_, and you can follow the show over on Instagram. That is at Kentucky Podcast. Any questions, comments, concerns, leave those in the YouTube comments below. Hit me on the socials. I will see you all tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Kentucky. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and God bless.